The saying, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, is widely reported to have been coined by US President Harry Truman. Unfortunately, when it comes to climate change and food security, we simply don't have that luxury. While we may not be able to stand the heat, leaving the kitchen is really not an option. Today on Shak Chat, we have Chelceé Brathwaite, who is a trade research assistant at the Shridath Ramphal Centre and a part-time micro and macroeconomics tutor at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Her research interests include e-commerce and digital trade, artificial intelligence, women and trade, and climate change and food security. Welcome, Chelceé, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Akeelia.
No problem. So when we talk about climate change, what exactly are the kinds of changes that we're talking about? Not to be dramatic, but I guess what are what are the doomsday predictions, so to speak?
Well, generally, when we define climate change, the term itself says exactly what it is. It's really a change in climate.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess that requires an understanding between the difference between weather and climate.
Okay.
So typically, weather refers, to the short-term changes in the atmosphere, whereas climate, it looks more at a long-term period of time, the
Mm-hmm.
atmospheric conditions in a specific area. So if we look at, for example, Barbados, and you said, what was the weather today? It was probably rainy, probably sunny. That's a
Mm-hmm.
short-term period. As opposed to now, if someone says, what's the climate like in Barbados? That's looking at the long-term weather projections over a longer span. So on average, we have, a tropical, sunny, warm climate, so to speak.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, one of the definitions that is most cited from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they usually define it as a change in the state of climate that can be identified by changes in the mean and or the variability of its properties, and that persists for an extended period, typically decades or longer. So simply put, is really just a phenomenon where we're seeing an observed change in the average climatic conditions over an extended time period, and we're usually talking about over decades or even longer. So yeah, it is kind of scary. It is a hot topic, and I think why it is a hot topic, as you would have said,
Yeah,
not
hot.
necessarily because it's doomsday, but because of the role that human activity is actually playing in accelerating the phenomenon. And there's a
Okay.
lot of factors that do contribute to it. So there are natural ones. We're not negating that there aren't. But then when we look at what's really driving it and accelerating it, it's usually describing the greenhouse effect, which in
Mm-hmm.
simple terms, that's where certain gases in the Earth's atmosphere prevent the sun from escaping, in turn warming the Earth. And what usually we have to ask ourselves, where do these gases come from? And when we
Mm-hmm.
analyze that, is mainly human activities. So actually, we actually published a policy brief recently on climate change, and they actually pinpointed where the emissions were coming from in terms of sectors. So the electricity and heat generation sector, that accounted for about 25% of these emissions. Industry itself accounts for a large amount, as well as the agricultural industry.
Mm-hmm.
Transportation accounts for about 14%, buildings for 6%, and so on. So all of these things at the end of the day are human activities that are in
Okay.
turn contributing to this phenomenon. So I think that's also why it is literally and figuratively a hot topic, because
Yeah.
you know we are contributing to it at the end of the day.
Yeah. So I mean, that was fairly comprehensive and that was quite informative. So how did you, I guess, become interested in climate change? I mean, was it just
Um,
other than it's a hot topic?
well, really, how I guess it would have started. Um, at my current job with the Shridath Ramphal Centre, where, as you said, I work as a trade research assistant, I do research on climate change as well,
Okay.
and food security under a changing climate. But I guess where it would have all started, I grew up on a plantation. I still live here. So I was
Okay.
always around like agriculture, always around growing crops, having livestock. And for me, yes, it was a means of, economic empowerment, because that's one way of earning money. You also
Yeah.
had that sense of responsibility, feeding the nation and what's not. But I guess how climate change really came into play is actually seeing the impacts firsthand. So I always remember we had this greenhouse that we
Mm-hmm.
had built. And when Hurricane Thomas came, I remember I didn't even know that a hurricane could bend metal like that. It completely destroyed the greenhouse. All the crops were lost. We also lost some livestock. So just seeing the impacts of these
Mm-hmm.
hurricanes over the years firsthand,
Okay.
that would have piqued my interest. And then I guess currently now facing this ongoing drought that we have, especially here in Barbados, you would know we have severe water scarcity problems, and seeing
Yeah.
how we have to battle with that on the agricultural front. Like, how are we gonna get these crops watered? What strategies we're gonna take? So for me, it's really a lived reality.
Okay.
So it's kind of like I can't really get away from it. I deal with it at work, and then I come
I
home and I
do.
have to deal with it again.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That makes sense to me. So I guess a lot of what we discuss on climate change too is around kind of, I guess, what they're calling clean versus dirty energy, and the work needed to kind of reduce the dependence on fossil fuels and that kind of thing. And I read somewhere where they mentioned that some of the amount of raw fuels required to produce clean energy and the social and economic impacts, that they may not, maybe we're just trading one issue for another. So I don't know if that is the case. I guess I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
For me, the technicalities of it, the cost benefit analysis, I can't really speak on. I could only be guided by the research. As you said, some
Mm-hmm.
individuals are saying that, well, at the end of the day, we might just be trading in one issue for the other. That may very well be the case. And again, we will have to rely on what the data says. But I know we are moving towards renewable and cleaner energy.
Yes.
Which for me, at the present moment, I would say I am satisfied by such a move compared
Mm-hmm.
to what we've seen in terms of the greenhouse emissions coming from the fossil fuels and stuff. We've seen the devastating impacts of that. So to me, if we're moving away towards renewable energy, that perhaps is a step in the right direction. But
Okay.
going forward, perhaps, as you said, there are some cost benefit analysis that need to be done. So perhaps refining our approach to renewable energy to make sure that we mitigate those side effects, like actually contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, that
Mm-hmm.
would necessarily be a step that perhaps even researchers here locally, because whenever we talk and read about these things, it's always outside of the Caribbean, people that are
That's true.
researching this. But
Yes.
if
Yes.
our researchers here, even at UE, or students get interested in looking at, for us, our renewable energy, whether it is solar or hydro, whatever the case may be, what impacts would this have on climate change? And tweaking and refining to make sure that when we do make this transition, that at least we would have mitigated as best as possible the contributions that this new avenue could have to climate change.
Yeah. And as you said, we're kind of moving towards renewable energy, and Barbados in particular is targeting being the first 100% green and carbon neutral state in the world by 2030, which is, quite an ambitious target. So hopefully,
Yeah.
so hopefully we get there. Hopefully we get there. We see the benefits of the changes that we implement. Um, the effects of climate change on food production, which is kind of what you were mentioning before, sometimes maybe can be, well, in some ways maybe overshadowed by the more dramatic, melting ice caps and tropical storms and rising sea levels and that kind of thing, all of which of course are significant. But what is the impact of climate change on food security, which is the access to sufficient, affordable, nutritious, food.
Yeah. So in terms of that, how I would probably discuss it is that when you look at climate change and food security and agriculture, they influence one another. So on one perspective, you do have climate change impacting the agricultural sector. The
Mm-hmm.
FAO, they did a report where they said that actually the agricultural sector, they absorb about 25% of the losses from climate related disasters. And we've seen that firsthand here. In 2004, Grenada, they would have lost almost 80% of their agricultural assets due to Hurricane Ivan.
Mm-hmm.
We had Hurricane Maria in 2017. In Dominica, they would have lost about 121 million US dollars in the agricultural sector alone. And when we look at the impact when it comes to the agricultural losses, the crops and the livestock that we lose, that not only has an implication on us being able to feed the nation, but it also has economic implications, because the agricultural sector still contributes around 12 to 17% of GDP across the Caribbean member states.
Okay.
It is a significant source of food, of course, and
Yeah.
it does contribute to employment and foreign exchange. So that in itself has far-reaching implications.
Yes.
Um, when we look at I found that one of the ways we try to combat, even though it may not necessarily be because of climate change, we import a lot of food.
Yes, we
So
do.
our food import bill is like well over, and when I say we, I mean the Caribbean. So CARICOM's food import bill exceeded about 5 billion US dollars. And I know Prime Minister Motley was talking about this point over and over and trying to reduce this bill.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we look at food security, although the definitions do not necessarily dictate where the food has to come from,
Mm-hmm.
overall there are two main avenues. You have food self-sufficiency, where we meet consumption needs through our own domestic production, and then food self-reliance, where we import food from the world market. And there's a lot of
Right.
debate in academic literature on these two avenues. But for me, I don't necessarily view them as either or, but rather complementary. So it's a case where we do need to develop a domestic agricultural sector capable of feeding our own people.
Yes.
But
Yes.
at the same time, because of the same climate change and other constraints, there will be cases where certain products and certain quantities we simply can't produce. And on that
Mm-hmm.
basis, we should definitely import. Um, but in that case, I think it's still necessary in making sure how then do we develop that domestic production, given, as you said, the climate change constraints. Is a case of looking merely at climate adaptation. So what are farmers doing at the national level to make sure that their crop yields are increasing, that they're
Mm-hmm.
coping, etc. So for me, while the climate change is a reality, we still need to make sure we're adapting. And I see a lot of it is coming out now, a renewed interest in developing our agricultural sector from COVID-19.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
seeing a lot of individuals encouraging backyard farming initiatives where me and you, we would have our own little plot. So it's a case where I can grow my lettuce, you grow your lettuce. We don't have to go to the supermarket for that. The food
Yeah.
import bill would come down, stuff like that. We also have the governments actually helping farmers, in terms of subsidies for different inputs, fertilizers, seedlings, water. That's a really big one, especially for Barbados.
Yes, for sure. That is definitely a challenge.
And for me, I ask myself every day, what can we do to actually overcome that, even from the farmer's perspective. And Justin Ram, he always used to say something that was really interesting. He always used to say, "We aren't small island states; we're actually big ocean economies," and
Well,
that's very true. All around us is just water. And while the rain may not be falling, the question I always ask myself, how can we use existing water masses to overcome these current constraints? And it
mm-hmm.
always takes
Yes.
me to desalination plants. And I don't know the technicalities of what is required for setting up one of these. So it might not be as easy as we're saying or discussing here. But for me, that would definitely be the starting point, because unless we're going to decide how we can create rain, I really feel that the solution lies in
And in the
being
ocean.
able to mobilize, the ocean's resources to help create and overcome the water scarcity challenges we're facing, and really help our farmers.
Yeah. That is actually pretty interesting. Um then I guess the other thing I think about in terms of the complexity of climate change and food security is that the agricultural sector, as you mentioned, is being impacted, but then it itself is kind of impacting on the greenhouse gas emissions. So I was just wondering how we reconcile, like we're being impacted, but also we're still kind of contributing to the problem.
Yeah. And that's why actually I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the second part I was to get to. Because remember at the beginning I said they influence one another, agriculture and climate change,
Yes.
where we saw climate change impacting agriculture, creating the losses and what's not. But as you rightfully said, agriculture is also contributing to climate change.
Yes.
One research actually I read earlier this week, it said that agriculture actually contributes about a quarter to the climate change that we're seeing today is because of agriculture and factory farming. So it's actually a situation where food and climate change both influence each other. And there was this news article by NBC News, and they noted that if we make small changes in our daily lives, especially the way we eat, we could actually alleviate much of the effects of climate change. So things like adopting a more plant-based diet. So when we look at livestock like cows, when they're fed grain, they produce significant amounts of the greenhouse gas methane. And that is one of the issues whenever we talk about how agriculture contributes, that's often cited.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the idea is, if you go towards adopting a more plant-based diet and what's not, we could actually reduce the greenhouse gas emission. They found that collectively, if we adopt a more plant-based diet, we could reduce the equivalent of up to 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. And I found that really interesting, because at the end of the day, agriculture is driven by what we consume. Farmers are not going to just grow plants or raise livestock for the
That
fun of it.
true that
you
nobody
know
wants, right?
Exactly. So it starts with us on what we consume, because that's going to drive our demand, drives their production. Another thing as well would definitely be using more locally and whole grown foods, because not only would it reduce our excessive food import bill and support our local farmers, which definitely is needed,
Yeah.
but it would also help with the climate change mitigation, because when we look at it, the processed foods that we tend to eat and we import, they require a lot more harvesting, a lot more processing, a lot more
Mm-hmm.
transportation. And
Yeah.
all of those things use a whole lot more fuel, which then in turn increases our greenhouse gas emission, as opposed to if we just had the cassava and the yams that we just take right out of the ground, not no processing required, anything like that. So that's another thing.
Yeah.
um in terms of reducing food waste as well, that's an important step, because about 30% of the world's food, it goes to waste annually, and it goes to landfills, and in a lot of cases landfills are oxygen starved, and that prevents the food waste from decomposing properly, which in turn then creates methane to leak into
Mm-hmm.
the atmosphere, again contributing to climate change. So again, all of these are little things we can do in terms of our consumption, our eating patterns, and again, some of the agricultural practices that the farmers do as well would play an important role, ensuring that the soils remain fertilized, not overusing or exhausting the land. All of those different things, definitely we have to take into consideration how we go about harvesting, the technologies that we use, are they giving off certain fuels, etc. So,
Yeah.
they're definitely related for sure.
Well, the thing is, I mean, you make a good point about plant-based diet. I mean, especially for us, I would say in Barbados, I am not sure if that would be necessarily a popular a popular direction. I mean, I feel it would be fair to say that we in Barbados are definitely meat moats. so
Sure,
so while that is quite interesting, that would definitely require I would say a cultural shift.
for sure,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah. So, you had mentioned also earlier about us not being small island states and etc. The discussion on food security and climate change also raises questions about like global justice and inequality, because the industrialized nations, they tend to generate more of the CO2 emissions. But it's like we are more impacted, but we have a small voice. So I, I don't know. There's also what I would refer to as the politics of climate change as well. So I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on maybe the things that we are doing or could do with our small voice.
Yeah, I would say that's really where the war on climate change is, because we contribute less than 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and we being small island developing states are likely to be the most impacted by the effects of climate change. And of course, in no world is that fair or even ideal, but I think dialogue on the issue is definitely needed,
Mm-hmm.
because even if we had the best climate adaptation measures in place and mitigation measures as well, if we really want to deaccelerate climate change, then mitigation must start with these big players, these industrialized countries, because it will
Yes.
always be a case of where we're kind of trying to catch ourselves. We're running, and is a race where we somewhat can't win
Yes.
because every
Yes.
time we try to adapt more and more, the effects get more and more grave. So we do need to have that dialogue with them. And I was actually really happy to see that our Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, she actually started that dialogue during the when she had the 16th Royal Press Speaks lecture, where
Mm-hmm.
she actually challenged, I don't know if you have watched that, but she challenged the world to reintervent the international order and do better by small states that are on the front lines of the climate change war. And
Yep.
she quoted that we did not start. So I think she used some very powerful words there. And that lecture had the attention of a lot of world leaders. So I think actually having that dialogue and really being able to hold these larger countries accountable is where it all starts. We the small voice thing, I think what we have to do, because Barbados represents one small island developing states, but there's a lot of small island developing states.
True.
And I think, if we come together on the global platform, and that's really what the late Owen Arthur, our former
Mm-hmm.
prime minister, he really was pushing for that. He always used to advocate for small and vulnerable economies. If we come together and make sure we're represented in each international organization. The idea is really for us to take up space, and if we take up space, our voice, as small as it is, it cannot be ignored. So I
Okay.
feel like that's what we have to continue to do, and keep trying to hold them responsible, keep having the dialogue, as uncomfortable as it may be, actually calling them out and saying, well, this is what it is, this is what we need to do. And we'd be surprised, because there are some leaders of industrial countries that, they are woke to these issues. It's not that they're
Mm-hmm.
ignoring it. It's just,
Yeah.
there are few, of course, that we know who
Yes.
outrightly, don't believe in climate change or what's not. But we work with the ones that are willing to work with us and hope for a better future.
Yeah, because I guess, I mean, really, it's our, like you correctly said, the front line of the war, because really our lives and our livelihood are really on the line. Um, then the other thing I was wondering about is, like, I mean, what's the worst case scenario? Maybe I shouldn't ask that, but in terms of like migration, because if the sea levels continue to rise, I mean, will there be a time where maybe we may have to move or relocate, or we can't occupy certain parts of the island? I don't know.
So I don't know if I can think of the worst case scenario, because I feel like nature always surprises us, and what we think is worse turns out not to be
No.
worse, because we never thought that we'd be in this situation with COVID-19. No.
Fair enough. I take that point.
But for what I can imagine, if we look at the social implications, for sure, one of the direct implications of climate change, whether we like it or not, is death. A lot of people, when we have extreme weather conditions, we have
Mm-hmm.
mortality rates. We can recall Hurricane Katrina in Florida, that had a mortality rate of greater than 1,000 people. In Hurricane Dorian, which we had recently in Bahamas, death toll of over 70 people. So it has a direct implication of a reduced population, reduced labor force. And then the thing is, the spin off from that is that the people like me and you, and we're seeing all of this happening, we begin considering the possibility of migrating to someplace safer, so to speak, which
True,
is less
true.
prone to the climate disasters, because we're not going to say, well, okay, Hurricane Dorian missed us and went for Bahamas. Let's start a family here and just hope and keep on hoping. Most
True.
people will probably be like, okay, let's see where we can go if we have the financial means, etc. And again, our Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, she spoke about this idea of climate refugees at one of the United Nations climate event summits. And she was saying that, mass migration due to climate change is a very real reality that could occur for us as small island developing states, and it would destabilize countries. And that
Mm-hmm.
in itself is a whole heap of other implications, because I remember times when our battle was, and still is, the idea of brain drain, where some of our brightest, they get
Yeah.
scholarships to go overseas and they don't remain. But imagine now we're not only facing brain drain, we're actually just facing mass migration,
Yes,
because
yes.
people want to survive. So now you have a country where there's no workforce, the brain drain is occurring. That's a destabilized economy. So for sure, that is a major problem in itself.
Yes, yes, yes. The other thing I was curious about is the specific impact to women when we discuss climate change and food security. Not only, I guess, not just here in the region, but maybe your thoughts, like, across the globe, if there are specific concerns when it comes to women who may be more vulnerable.
Okay, so just a disclaimer, I'm not very versed in this area, but from reading and basic understanding of certain stuff, what the research is showing is that the existing gender inequalities, they're likely to be exacerbated by climate change. So
Mm-hmm.
the reality is we live in a world where there's a lot of gender inequalities, right back from pay, women are more likely to be in poverty, et cetera, and the list goes on.
Yes.
So what they're saying is that the challenges or the struggles that women already face, they are going to intensify because of climate change. So things like heat waves, droughts, extreme storms, rising sea levels, they would disproportionately affect women.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense, if we take a case of a female that was struggling and she maybe had a small plot of land and that was her route for economic empowerment. Imagine now when she has to deal with, preparing herself and her family for hurricane preparations. But not only is she dealing with managing the household, dealing with those preparations, the psychological stress and trauma, but then the hurricane or the drought comes and literally destroys her means of livelihood. She's
Yeah.
back, it's like she took 5 steps forward and now she's 10 steps backward. So it's a case where that can occur, where the struggles women are already facing will begin to intensify. But I think that's been recognized because in the Paris Climate Agreement, they actually included specific provisions to ensure that women receive support to cope with the hazards of climate change. So there are gender-specific commitments in the Paris Climate Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of women are becoming more involved as well. So if you look at activists in climate change and global warming, there's Greta Thunberg,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
really young female. There's Vanessa Nakate as well. And then world leaders like Christiana Figueres, she actually spearheaded the Paris Climate Agreement. So there are those leaders. And then here in the Caribbean, again, our own prime minister, in
Mm-hmm.
almost all of her speeches, she continuously brings up the topic of climate change. So I think female voices are being considered, and I feel once female voices are considered, they will be able to voice the concern of women as well. And going forward, when we tackle the climate change crisis, there will be consideration to the perhaps extra provisions that will be needed to ensure that the gender inequalities aren't exacerbated, but are actually reduced and eventually eradicated.
Yeah, well, that is definitely our hope because I mean, as you said, that burden would definitely fall with with us. The consequences would definitely fall with us
Yeah, for
as
sure.
women. So that was actually really really interesting and informative. So lastly, I know you're passionate about Barbados and the region, so I'm just wondering what's up next on your research list, just out of curiosity.
On my research list in terms of climate change, what I would really like to do, because it isn't really existing right now in a, or I should say in a comprehensive document, is to really catalog or track the different climate change strategies, whether it be mitigation and or adaptation, that we're taking at a national level, so across all 15 CARICOM member states, as well as at a regional level, because I feel like we never could really go and find this information online. It's like I have to sit on
Mm-hmm.
individually type in Barbados, then I have to see, and then it might not even be under one section. So just to see what's actually happening on the ground nationally and then from a regional perspective, that is something I'm interested in, because I feel like to go forward, we need to know what we're doing now, make sure we're not duplicating resources and what's not, and really come up with a sound strategy
Mm-hmm.
and plan going forward. So for me, that was the area that I would really like to get started on, or to just begin to catalog the measures and what we're trying to do. And for sure, in the future going forward, particularly for food security and for the agricultural sector, I'm definitely interested in making sure, because in a lot of cases, we as researchers, we push out a lot of research, but it's difficult, or for the region, what I found was a challenge is we don't really streamline research outputs into tangible, practical,
Mm-hmm.
hands-on efforts. So
Mm-hmm.
whereas we may have a bunch of recommendations for farmers, how feasible is the implementation of it for the farmers? How practical is it? Are they actually doing it? Have we given the support needed to actually carry it out? So my hope really is that any research I do in this area, I could actually have streamlined into practical application and not just have sitting there as a research output.
Yeah, and I mean, as you rightly said, well, data is important. We can't know what we're doing if, we don't really know what is going on, if we don't really have the data to make the right decision.
For sure.
Well, I just want you to know that then we're definitely counting on you, Chelsea. Okay?
No pressure.
No pressure. So thanks so much for your time today, Chelsea. Climate change, I would have to say, is definitely a daunting issue to contemplate, but it really helps to have a better understanding of the issue and perhaps how we can turn things around. So this really was informative. Maybe I will consider becoming a vegetarian. I can't make any promises.
Hopefully I will follow your lead as well. But thank you so much for having me, Akeelia.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to join us every other Wednesday for another episode of Shak. Subscribe to our podcast using your favorite podcast platform. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can also connect with us on IG, Facebook, and Twitter, or by email at akeelia@shakshak.club. Let's shake things up.